No.
Okay, so this is lecture 13 of the Dead Sea Scrolls series. We're talking about daily life in Qumran here. So we're really getting into the nitty gritty of what it was like for these people to live. And it helps us really remember they're not simply figures we read about from scrolls, but these were real people who had real lives. And we're going to get a sense of what life was like in this very interesting and unique community. So we're going to start. What exactly did Roland Vox find? Remember, he was one of the initial archaeologists to excavate the area. So he found a tower, pottery matter manufacturing area, a kitchen with a pantry, a meeting hall, a scriptorium, cisterns, and mikvaot. Those are the ritual baths. As we know, this was a very religious community, which was very focused on rules of purity. So it's not surprising they would have mikvaot here. It's also at this point not much of a surprise. They don't have private homes either. It's not a surprise because we know they really lived a communal lifestyle, and this certainly is one of the reasons why scholars are pretty sure they lived a very communal type lifestyle. There's also been a path found between the site and the caves where the scrolls were found. Remember, the caves are, forgot how much exactly it was, but it's a short walk, but it's a little bit of a walk. So the caves and the site seem to be part of the same community, and the same people were using both. Now, where exactly did they live? So one of the suggestions is perhaps they lived in tents, which would leave very little trace. So of course, that'd be hard to find. Basically, you pack up the tents and leave. And think about it nowadays: you go camping thousands of years later, no one's really going to know you went camping there because you camped in a tent. It's possible they actually could have lived in these caves and walked into the site on a daily basis to do their daily activities, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's been artifacts in the caves found which indicate that people were conducting business of daily life in them. And it's also possible they could have been living in the site, but instead of tents, perhaps maybe some sort of dorm style facility, where scholars still really are unsure about it. Now, Josephus, talking about the Essenes in general, not just this group, says the Essenes rose at dawn to pray together. So this is nowadays what we call vatikin or davening nates, hanetz hachamat, sunrise, where the idea is that you get up very early in the morning and you're supposed to even start davening the preliminary prayers up through basically the Shema, even before we get to sunrise. Dawn is defined basically in the Mishnah as when the first lights come over the horizon. And the Talmud provides us with a couple different examples of how to indicate what that is. Nowadays, you just look on the computer if you want to know these times. And you could look on websites like MyZmanim, which will tell you exactly when, as far as the Jewish calendar is concerned, dawn is each day and sunrise and these nice things. But the Talmud says it's when you could see someone basically from a short distance away and recognize them. Or another way of indicating it's dawn is if it's light enough out where you could look at your sit seat and distinguish between the white strand and the tachelet, which was that turquoise type of strand, which was lost and now been rediscovered. And people are starting to get it again on their. So really, I'll say talasim, but the proper way to say it is really talitot is really the correct Hebrew, but I know people say talasim. And the reason people do that, and the reason why they would rise so early, you say, well, what's the rush? Why do they have to get up at dawn? They can't sleep until an hour past dawn or whatever it may be. So the idea is you want to be what's the word I'm looking for? You want to be eager. That's the word I'm looking for, to fulfill the mitzvot at the earliest possible juncture. So, what's the earliest time you could daven the Shema and fulfill that mitzvah? A little before sunset, basically when the base after dawn, a little before sunset. What's the earliest time you can fulfill the obligation of davening the Amida? Right as the sun comes up. I said sunset, excuse me, I meant sunrise. So And if you go ever do this, go to the Kotel, the Western Wall, it's really an incredible scene where everyone has their little minyan and people are davening at their own rates. And then right as it gets to sunrise, this utter silence falls over the plaza as everyone silently begins the Amidah. So the idea is you're reciting the Amidah at the first possible moment in order to fulfill the mitzvah. The term in Hebrew is Lizi Makdimim the mitzvah. You want to be fulfill the mitzvah at the first possible fashion. Think about that's often why a brit milah is held during the morning, because you want to do it can do it any time during the day, but you want to do it during the morning. And likewise, I forget. I blanked out. I'm sorry. I'm getting a little older. Sorry. I had another example and I totally blanked. Oh, I remember it now. The other example is Vayashkim Avraham Baboker. Abraham rises early in the morning to sacrifice Isaac. So even to do this mitzvah, which is very difficult, he rises early to show his eagerness to do it. Now, in the Talmud, it actually suggests that why was he getting up early? He was getting up early to daven Shachrit, and this is the beginning of Shachrit. He invents Shachrit. Okay. Everyone still hear me? Just checking.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
excellent. Thank you, Ron. Okay. Sometimes when it gets quiet, I kind of wonder. Okay, so the community rule notes that the same practice mentions evening prayers as well. So the community rule, if you remember, we spoke about it. This is one of these documents which really lay out the procedures for daily life in the sect. So Josephus talks about the Essenes davening in the morning, which would include the sect most likely, being that it's widely believed they were a form of Essenes. But we see this sect is also davening in the evening as well. Now, what's particularly interesting about noting here that they're davening in the evening? And I realize from our perspective, what's the big deal? They davened in the morning, they probably davened in the afternoon, and they davened in the evening like we do, Shacharit, Mincha, Ma'ariv. Anyone from a Talmudic historical point of view see something particularly interesting about this?
Rabbi?
Yes, Scott.
Well, the traditional way is that we davened to commemorate the Tamid, the morning and the afternoon sacrifice. There was no evening sacrifice.
Correct. So you're on the right track. Absolutely, Scott. Right. So that's actually more than the right track. You basically got it. Let me just fill in a little bit here. So originally we just had Shachrit and Mincha, being there was a morning sacrifice and an afternoon sacrifice, and we're reading about this on Vayikra now as we read the Parshiot. So we have these daily sacrifices. There was no nighttime sacrifice. My guess is simply because before light bulbs and all that stuff, things shut down more at night. Particularly in the ancient world, you're just less likely to have these functions at night. So over time, we have an evening service develops. And in the Talmud, by the way, there are discussions as to whether davening Ma'ariv is even a requirement. Is it a reshut? In other words, it's something that you can do kind of like, I hate to use the word, it sounds juvenile, but like extra credit, or an extra opportunity to daven. Or is it something which is like a chovah, which means is a requirement? And over time, certainly we see it does become a requirement over time. The way later on Jewish law looks at it. But it's interesting at this point. This is really during the Mishnaic period, even before the later part of the Talmud, the Gemara. And this is before even the Mishnah is canonized in 200 of the Common Era. We're talking about this sect went out of business in 68 of the Common Era. So we're seeing some sort of idea of evening prayers. Now, it is possible evening prayers could have been more of like a mincha late afternoon thing. If you remember when Yitzhak is, the rabbis credit Yitzhak for instituting mincha, just as Abraham instituted Shachrit. He institutes mincha bein arba'im, which means kind of like between the eves. In other words, in the late afternoon, it seems to be he invents this Ma'ariv prayer according to the Talmud. The Talmud is working off what the Torah says, so it credits him for instituting Mincha, and then the Talmud credits Yaakov by way for instituting Ma'ariv. But just I found that interesting that I talked about them doing evening prayers and maybe the hint of what we would today call Ma'ariv. All right, let's look at what these people did for a living here, work. Philo and Josephus say the Essenes engaged in agriculture, which really isn't particularly surprising, being that many people participate in agriculture. Maybe it's like saying someone is involved in business. Okay, a lot of people are involved in business. Doesn't really tell us very much. There is certainly evidence of agriculture found at Qumran. They were manufacturing also things like baskets, wool and linen, pottery for cooking, and for storage of food and scrolls. So they had containers for their scrolls, and we know some of these have some of these turn up later. And also they're making parchment, being that they have this scriptorium and they seem to be very into copying these scripts. That seems to be a big part of what's going on here. They also found coins, which is either an indication of commerce with the outer world, or it could also mean newer members would surrender their money to the communal treasury of a yachad, to the community as they entered, or it could be a combination of both. We're not really
Rabbi,
sure.
Rabbi,
Yes, yes.
Are we saying that the environment or the climate was much more conducive to agriculture only 2,000 years ago?
No, we're not. And that's a good question, Sam. We're going to get to that. That's going to kind of tangentially come up, but we're not. It always seemed to be a desert. And we talk about they got this, they get their water, they seem to be able to channel off water from the Wadi Qumran, which is in the En-Gedi area. All of it. And I know you've been to Israel a bunch of times, Sam. So they seem to be getting water from this general En-Gedi. I don't know if it's En-Gedi itself, but the general En-Gedi oasis, that area, they seem to be getting enough to do limited agriculture of some sort.
But the Qumran is up in the hills. I mean, it's not lowland at all, right?
But where the sect was below the cave area, which is a bit lower down. But you're right in the sense that this is not ideal.
That's the Dead Sea.
Yeah, right. It's not.
We're not getting water from that for sure.
No, right. It's not ideal. Certainly, and you still see it today in modern Israel, quite honestly, where half the population lives in the Gush Dan area, which is basically I don't know if Israelis would say I'm using the term correctly, but basically the Tel Aviv metropolitan area, Tel Aviv and the suburban area, which is the Fertile Crescent. And it was like this in the ancient times too, in the sense that that was always the coveted land, the strip by the Mediterranean, because it was good for farming and agriculture. These people, my guess is, and from reading the two professors I'm basing the class on, basically what's going on here is they picked the spot because they don't want to be bothered with other people. They want to have their own segregated community. And one of the activities they were doing was agriculture, even though it must have been very difficult. And we're gonna see in a slide or two, basically, because of this, it seems to be, at least they suspect, as people got older, and they just weren't cut out for this type of life. I mean, would you? You're making a good point. Who would really want to try to work this type of land? I certainly wouldn't. It seems like a very difficult proposition. So it seems like people come here when they're younger, when they go older, when they get older, it seems like perhaps they went back to Jerusalem. They just couldn't take such a rigorous life. All right, good question, Sam.
So where do they get the wherewithal to make baskets and write Torah scrolls? Where did all this stuff come from?
Okay, so in an earlier lecture we touched on there does seem to be some sort of commercial transaction between them and Jerusalem, which is the nearest big city of sorts. So even though they were an isolated community and basically they wanted to be left alone, it doesn't mean it wasn't like a self-sustaining community with all its natural resources. Quite the opposite. As Sam has pointed out, these are in a barren desert, basically. So they do seem to be getting some supplies from Jerusalem or possibly other locations. So I think Jonathan Jaffe, I heard.
So maybe you covered this in the beginning, but so Josephus, he writes about this community. I mean,
when we think of writing about a community, we go visit, we take notes, maybe we hobnob with the people we interview. I mean, was it clear he physically visited there and quote unquote took notes and they shared things with him? Or he kind of heard from traders what goes on there?
No, so that's a good point. So remember, Josephus is talking about the Essenes in general, which are one of the three sects which are spread out across the country. He probably came across Essenes as being an influential person himself and being a zealot general before surrendering to Vespasian and the Romans. So you have to believe he had real in person or firsthand encounters with Essenes. As far as this group goes, I don't know of any direct encounter with the Qumran sect. So everything Josephus is telling us about the Essenes is just about the Essenes. It's not directly about this, but what makes it valuable still is that it's pretty or almost universal agreement that this is at least a group of Essenes, probably a more hardcore group of Essenes. The less hardcore group of Essenes would be people who are probably living in a Essene lifestyle, but in either big cities or right outside of big cities, as opposed to a group like this who really goes out of its way to find a location which is out of the way, and no one else is going to really necessarily say, I want this great piece of farmland here. So keep that in mind. That's a good point, Jonathan. When Josephus is talking about the Essenes, it's the Essenes as a group in general, not this particular Essene offshoot or group. Okay. Any other questions before I continue? Okay, let's look at the routine, daily life. Okay, so again, so Josephus talking about the Essenes in general here, not just the Qumran group, but we believe that they followed a similar type of pattern. So to the 5th hour of so we already know they're getting up at dawn to daven. Then they're going to perform labor to the 5th hour of the day. And then they assemble for ritual bathing and communal dining. So think about this. They're not happy with what's going on in the temple because they feel it's being run by these impure Sadducees, basically, or these proto-rabbinic Pharisees also are getting involved in it and telling them to do things the wrong way. So they have their own, not obviously it's not a temple, but their own holy community here. And they're going to import some of the ritual, just like the Kohanim would go in the mikveh and immerse before offering sacrifices. They're going to have these communal meals which are holy, so they're going to go in the mikveh. I mean, we have a vestige of this in the sense we do netilat yadayim before you make hamotzi. But imagine every time you had a formal meal going in the mikveh, and you could see why they would need such a segregated community that would allow them this type of schedule, because most people think about your daily life. Even nowadays, if you had every time you wanted to have a real sit-down meal, you have to go basically take it's a spiritual bath, but it's still a bath. You still have to go in the water. It's a bit of a process. It takes a lot more than it does to do netilat yadayim and make hamotzi. Okay. So,
Rabbi,
yes.
Do you know what the fifth hour of the day is?
Okay, so the 5th hour of the day should be 5 hours after sunrise. Now, okay. I should tell you later on, or the Mishnah, which is developing during this period, and again is codified 200 of the Common Era, after this sect has ceased from being, in quote unquote Jewish time, and I don't mean running 20 minutes late to things, not in the joke sense, but in Jewish time, Jewish legal time. The daylight hours are divided into 12 halachic hours, which means you take the amount of sunlight there is during a particular day, and you divide by 12. So that means in the summer, a halachic hour could be, let's say, an hour and 15 minutes. In December, January, it could be 45, 50 minutes. And that's why, by the way, the time for what's the earliest time you could daven certain prayers in the morning, as we spoke about, what's the latest time you could daven the Shema or the Amida in the morning, and these things fluctuate day by day. They only fluctuate a minute or two per day, like a minute a day, something like that. But they fluctuate because halachic, these hours, my guess is this sect was working off this something like this concept too, because their day had to be organized around prayer. So it's probably my guess is probably 5 halachic hours after the sun rose. They're probably doing their work. And so my point is, it wouldn't be like we think of 5 hours and say is 11 a.m. 6 a.m. is the beginning, then 11 a.m. It probably fluctuated, but was probably later morning is my guess, something like that.
Rabbi?
Which may just one sec, just may make sense as well, simply because it gets hot and they may have needed a break. I think that was Alan.
Yeah, the way you explained it, if I can paraphrase it, what this means, if they were up before dawn, so they could daven at dawn, this 5th hour is if it takes them time for the mikvah and their meal, the 6th hour is already the midday. It's mid daylight. So this formally ends it describes what they're doing in the morning, as you said, but it divides the day in half, essentially when they're done with this stuff of bathing and dining.
Right, it does. It does. You're right. It does divide the day in half rather well. And just an interesting side note is, in this region of the world, it's just not all that far from the equator. I mean, if you look at Israel on the map, basically, I think it really pairs up with like South Carolina or Georgia, something like that. The time fluctuations aren't going to be nearly as much as, let's say, if you're in England or the northern parts of Canada or something like that, where you may have these wild fluctuations. You have the fluctuations more or less will keep you, right, as Alan says, to the middle of the day. So this is the schedule they're working with here. So then they retire for the ritual bath, their communal dining, and they bless before and after. So we're seeing the and again, looking back, you're saying, well, that's not particularly interesting. We make a bracha before, we get a bracha rishona, hamotzi, or shahakol, or whatever, mazono, whatever it is. And afterwards, if you eat bread, you say birkat hamazon, which is the full benching, or if not, you make a bracha achrona, like an al chamichya, or a fashot, which is a shorter after blessing, depending on what you eat. But what I did find interesting about this, again, in Mishnaic times, now this is where really we're having the idea of blessing before eating comes up. The blessing of eating, the idea of blessing after eat is derived from the Torah, because the Torah tells us that you shall eat, you shall be satiated, and you shall bless. So we have a command being derived from the Torah, which is pretty close to explicit, basically explicit, telling we're supposed to do some sort of blessing after we eat. Now, the formula for the blessing, the formulaic pattern of Birkat Hamazon is obviously comes later, where it has like an Amida type of structure with different prayers. But at least the idea of blessing is from the Torah. But the idea of blessing before you eat is clearly a rabbinic invention. To put it bluntly, if you saying Birkat Hamazon, you fulfill a biblical mitzvah dioraita. And if you blessing before, while it's important, is a lower level in the sense that it's derabanan, it's only rabbinic in nature. So they're both important, but we see already at this stage there was an idea of blessing beforehand, which I guess it shouldn't be particularly surprising because this is during the Mishnaic era. So we have these ideas already going around that it's not enough to bless after you eat, but the rabbis are going to require you to bless before you eat as well. And we see that this sect was on board with that general idea. Now, what was the formula of their blessings? Was it the same blessings that we make? That's a different story, but at least the general idea they accepted as well. Okay, so after lunch, then it was basically back to work. And we know that there was some sort of evening prayers as well, whether it was really like more of like a mincha late afternoon time or Ma'ariv. We're not quite sure, but there was some sort of prayers later.
Okay, on the tour that we took at Qumran, after lunch, they went and copied the Torah. That's
Okay.
what they did.
So was that everyone? Was that everyone, Lydia?
Yes.
Or was that just okay?
Or the majority, certainly. I mean,
Okay.
some people might be doing other things, but the vast majority were actually copying the Torah.
Okay, so and which is not surprising, being that it's clear this was a central function of what was going on. It would certainly may make sense to do that. You're out in the morning, hopefully before it got at least before it got too hot, and then in the afternoon you may want to be indoors simply because of the sheer heat of. A lot of you have been to Israel, particularly in the summer. And I like the heat too, but it's just plain hot out there. And they say it's dry, it's still hot.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's very hot.
Yeah, it's dry heat or not, hot is hot. Okay. The population. So they believe that there was 150 between 150 and 200 at any given time. So this was not a big community. They're not sure how many were men, women, or children. They have been able to determine at least get a ballpark, this 150, 200, based on the number of graves which they found and how much rainwater could be collected and channeled from Wadi Qumran. So this goes to what someone, I think Sam was, who brought it up before about where are they, how are they farming? Well, and they're in the middle of a very arid region. So this is how they're getting the water here. And I mentioned this before. The skeletons show that most of the people who die while they're there are younger, likely due to the harsh conditions. So it's believed, at least, that as people got older, they just couldn't take such a rough type of lifestyle. Say, go back to places like Jerusalem, to Jerusalem, and go back to other Essene communities, which had the benefits of living in a more populous place. I don't know, maybe nowadays it's like people when they sell their house and they move into a condo because they don't have to deal with mowing the lawn and all that fun type of stuff. Okay, so, but that would certainly explain why the skeletons are young. The people are living there in those tough conditions and without modern medicine. It would make sense that people who didn't live through that and were able to go back to Jerusalem, unfortunately, may die earlier.
Rabbi,
Yes.
when you use the word young, are you talking about children or young adults or both?
We seem to be talking about basically young adults. I remember young adults could be 16 years old too. We think of adult as 18.
Right. No, I follow that.
No,
sure.
but we're not talking about infant mortality or a 2-year-old. Talking about, it's a good question, Alan. We're talking about basically young adults here. Okay. Sorry. So
that could tie into this slide. If there
yes,
were no
and sorry, it
women
all
around.
popped up at once. But yeah, so it does tie into this slide. Thank you, Sam. So we're looking at the gender here. So it was originally believed that this was basically a celibate sect. They didn't have any women around, based on the readings of some of the scrolls. There's no reference to women in the community rule, so which really sets up the parameters of what daily life is going to be like. So it makes sense that people would say, well, this group was not interested in women. Remember, they're apocalyptic in nature. The world is coming to an end anyway, so we don't have to really worry about the next generation because end of times, God's kingdom anyway. Pliny the Elder, who we met before, says the Essenes he encountered, so this is not the Qumran sect, but other Essenes, lived without women. This was not all, but some lived without women and renounced love, while Philo and Josephus noted that some were celibate. So what seems to be happening here is there are Essenes who are celibate. There are Essenes who are not celibate. And it was believed originally this sect was a celibate one, but hold your horses here, because we see, however, we later on when they're going through the scrolls, and we know it took them a long time to really even get access, and it came in drips and drabs. It wasn't like they translated them all at once and printed a book. So other scrolls, there's mention of women such as other famous scrolls like Damascus document, the War Scroll, and the Messianic Rule. And in the cemetery, there were some female skeletons found. So it's possible there were limited women. Some people were celibate there, or at times maybe it was totally celibate, guys only type of thing. At times it wasn't. Remember, we're talking, what would he say, 140 or so before the Common Era to 68, somewhere, or maybe a little before 140. I forgot the start date, but it's certainly possible over that stretch. At times it was a celibate group, at times it wasn't a celibate group, or it could have been a hybrid. All right, let's look at the Ostercon. Now, what in the world's an Ostercon? So it means an inscribed piece of pottery, which will give us information. So this was dug up in 1996. The text is a deed of a gift indicating the transfer of property from Hani to Viyacha, to the collective group at Qumran, via and Elazar ben Nachmani. So this Hani guy, as he's joining the group, is surrendering his personal property to V'yachad here, which goes along this idea that everything is communal, as I just said. So it's confirming what was thought already about this. They weren't big into personal property. What's also interesting is a reference to Hani's slave, too. The slave's name happens to be Hista. And Philo and Josephus say that the Essenes, not just the Qumran sect, but the Essenes as a group did not own slaves. Yet the Damascus document does reference at least slaves. Okay, and it says a man should not provoke his male or female slave or hired hand on Shabbat. So okay, so your slave or servant is supposed to get off on Shabbat. Now, I like to remind people, when we're talking about slaves, we're really talking probably more about indentured servants. If you look at the Torah, and it talks about at least the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew slave owned by another Hebrew, you're paying the person, so it's not quite the way we use the term. Certainly, it's not a good thing to be. You're on the bottom of society, but just wanted to point that out. Now, unfortunately, this piece of pottery is badly broken, particularly the parts mentioning the slave. So we don't know, for instance, was the slave freed when Hani joined the group, or being that they were communal, did he have to share the slave with everyone else, and the slave not only did his chores but helped everyone else? We just really don't know. Okay, so the next lecture is going to be another piece of literature which is specific to the sect, with a halachic letter, which is really going to help us define the sect even more. Let me exit out of this and go to Q&A.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I remember reading something in the Serech HaYachad, the community rule, that they said that when they would eat, they would have 3 Kohanim sit at the head, and they would sit in groups of 12, like the 12 tribes that would oversee the meal, and they would do the blessings. And it was just interesting. But the 3 Kohanim, these leaders, it's interesting because in some of the Christian documents, some of the leaders of their group would be in 3s: Cephas, James, and I think John. So whoever is writing these New Testament documents may be familiar with the form of what these Qumran people were doing, that they had some kind of leaders in a group of 3 that would lead the community, eating session or whatever it was called.
And even nowadays, you have a Zimun for Birkat Hamazon as well.
Yeah.
You have 3.
Oh, that's
so,
right.
I mean, certainly wouldn't be surprising, as we've discussed in this class and the other history class, how religious practices from one group affect another. So while we don't know for sure, that would not be a surprise at all. All right, good point, Scott. Thank you. Anyone else? No,
Based
you
in
guys
is
letting me
also
off
3.
easy tonight. Go ahead, Sam.
I said a based in is also 3.
Yeah, right. So based in or a bet in is also 3 as well. Now there you could see why you have a limited amount for 3, simply to break a tie.
Right.
But yes, so exactly. So and you have to, when they view these meals, they viewed it as just like the idea is like in a bet in, the idea is that God joins the court because it's engaged in this holy activity of judgment. These meals were really a holy activity, and probably in some way or another, they viewed it as just as we do Birkat you wash and do Birkat Hamazones, and you're making what's an otherwise mundane, very natural base type thing to do, to eat. You need food. You're elevating it into a spiritual activity as opposed to just looking at it as I'm eating because I'm hungry and I need it to live and I like the taste of it. So I think it's pretty certain that this group really view these meals as they're coming together as a community. They're doing all this washing. This was really a way of feeling that God was among them as they're doing all of this. And we spoke a little bit, I think it was last week, about how they had these divisions among the way that the group was organized. You had Kohanim, you had Levim, and you had the regular people, the Yisraelim as well. So it's interesting you pointed out that they organize with the Kohanim and the meals and all of that, Scott. Okay. Anyone else? You're going to let me off easily tonight. Not too much, not too many questions and answers. Jonathan.
So I guess you sort of answered it. Same question about Pliny, or however I'm supposed to pronounce it. So he writes about the Essenes, but we don't think he visited or took notes. He just was chatting with people in Jerusalem or wherever he went, and they said, well, we got this crazy group over here, and he wrote notes. I mean, do we know that he had physical contact? Did he ever share a meal?
Pliny was the one I have in an earlier workshop we spoke about him. Somewhere in the back of my mind is saying that I think he may have actually gone to the site there. I think he talks about in his travels going there, and it could have been this site. But they're not sure if it was this site or some other community in the general vicinity or something like that. But I don't remember off the top of my head. I vaguely remember talking about this. If you just give me 1 minute, I'll just grab the book and it will tell me in the back one way or the other.
While I have a group here, just because we're killing time, I'm sorry about the shofar delivery. We're wrestling with US, but mine just showed up today for April. And we're trying to figure out, I mean, it took 16 days to get delivered. So the United States Post Office is just a mess.
I think that's a general statement.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't know what to do, but I'm sort of apologizing to a group here, and look online for information, because I don't know how to mail it to you.
Okay, so actually he doesn't mention, I thought he was going to mention Pliny in the back of the book where he just gives you the little bullet points about, yeah, so we could look into that, Jonathan. I don't remember. I vaguely, do you remember, Scott, by any chance? I vaguely remember something about he was in the general area. Maybe he actually visited.
Yeah, I just know he was a contemporary. I don't know about his particular travels if he was there. I just cannot. I mean, I can suggest something like this that might be very interesting, because Jonathan raises some good points. How do we know what these people were doing other than word passing along, from these other so-called historians? But another thing that could be, and this is suggested by Eisenman, was that Paul, the apostle, could have been a plant sent by King Agrippa too, who was there, because he goes to Damascus. Everybody thinks it's the Syria Damascus, but if the land of Damascus was where the Qumran sect was, and if he was there, he could have been like a reconnaissance, finding out what these people knew, because they were so anti-Roman. And he could have been reporting in some of the customs that he reports to King Agrippa when he reports back, because he comes back to Jerusalem with this. And remember, he's sent on a mission by the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And they are aligned with Rome. So he could have been reporting these activities of these Qumran sect. So, and he definitely lived at that time. So there could be another source in the Paul's books or writings, could be who these people were. Because he gets debriefed by King Agrippa and his sister Berenice. The Acts says that he comes back to talk to him. Could he have been reporting on what these, or if these people were the Qumran sect?
Okay, so
Rabbi,
yes.
that worldwide source Wikipedia says that Pliny, however you pronounce it, let's see if I could read it here. He said, being a geographer, he located them in the desert, on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. So that from that I infer that he must have encountered at least some Essenes.
Okay, and he died in 79, so he's basically living through the destruction of the Second Temple and of the end of this community. Okay, so somewhere in here, I can't find it right now. Somewhere in here, he does mention something about Pliny, I think, being in at least the general area. I don't know if he got a tour, shall we say, but had a familiarity generally.
Some of these archaeological sites in Israel or other places, they dig down and they find this big burned out layer where there was a big conquest and fire. And so when the Romans were marching through everywhere, I mean, when they did the archaeological dig at Qumran, is there a layer of ash? Was it burned down, or did the Romans not even bother, or they just killed everybody without having to burn the place down? I mean, I'm not.
So as far as I can tell, is they seem to the Essenes, the Qumran sect wasn't stupid and basically evacuated more than stuck around. I mean, I think under the best circumstances, these people weren't warriors. It wasn't like Masada, where at least they had soldiers there. I mean, that's a fight they couldn't win too. But it was more seemed to just evacuate, and the place was abandoned, and that was the end of it. It wasn't like the Rome probably wasn't even worth the Romans' time beyond that. Good question, Jonathan. Okay, anything else? No? Okay, so thank you for joining me again. I really enjoyed this, and